8mm home movies. Regular.
That's something.
I wish I had, my parents had shot more close-ups, but especially of Rick, but they didn't know him as well, so they obviously concentrated on their kids. But if you look, Rick's always kind of in the background.
Get some lens tissue for that one.
Good evening. I'm Eric Lichtenfeld. Richard Anderson and tonight's Master of Ceremonies, my good friend John Muto, graciously said that that I should open tonight's memorial because I had a few announcements to make. But then Richard said I should also share an anecdote about Rick. So thanks to Richard, instead of getting a short announcement, you get a short announcement and a long story. So I knew Rick for around 13 years, and about halfway through that tenure, I started writing my first book. It was a history of the modern action movie. And I was very excited to tell Rick about this and to share my ideas with him and where it was going to go and all of that. And when I told him, he just sort of looked off and said, well, why aren't you starting with some obscure trend of 1960s? I don't even know what they are. And it was just all I could do to keep my shoulders from sagging just right there. Because, obviously that was Rick with that encyclopedic knowledge that I know we're all going to hear more about tonight. And then later on, much later, when the book was published, one day I was very surprised to receive from Rick a book review that he wrote and that he circulated among the cronies. And his review was extremely positive. I mean, very, very complimentary. And when I saw that, I discovered one of two extraordinary things. One, that as a film historian, I had actually managed to pass muster with Rick Mitchell. Or two, that Rick was capable of great charity or pity. So Richard had asked me to share a story, and this one came to mind. And in thinking about it afterwards, I have to tell you, I was like, that's not really a very good story. This is not that great a story. And what I realized in turning that over was that for all the time I knew Rick, I don't have a whole lot of different stories about Rick. What I have or had is kind of one experience of Rick. It was one experience that lasted 13 years. Rick was a constant. Rick was a fixture. And I think that's why, even though we all knew that Rick, he wasn't in good health, and he wasn't a man of great means, despite all of that, when I learned that he was gone, I was shocked. As crazy as it sounds, I was really shocked, and I stayed shocked. I was shocked in a place that's just deeper than logic. And I knew that even though Rick and I weren't close in the way that friends who've known each other a long time are conventionally close, I knew I was going to miss him, and I do miss him. So I'm standing here right now at the top of this evening for two reasons. One is that I was Rick's friend, and the other is that I'm also a new staff member of the Academy. And I wanted to acknowledge that while this is not one of the Academy's official events, the organization has been extremely supportive and very generous in helping us gather to commemorate Rick. And that goes from the folks in the archive, especially Fritz Herzog and Dan Sherlock, to the Department of Theater Operations, and all the way up to some of the highest levels of the Academy's leadership. I hope I'm not talking out of school when I tell you that. I'm very proud and I'm very grateful that they've helped us to give Rick a memorial that I really don't think even Rick would have imagined that he would have received. So if we could, I'd like to acknowledge the Academy for that. And I also wanted to share some news on a related subject. The Academy Film Archive, one of the world's most prestigious, has added much of Rick's film collection to its own. So much of what Rick spent his life collecting and screening will be saved, and it will be made available to others. It will reside with some really, really good company. And that's not all. Yeah. But that's not all. Some of you may know about the book Rick had been attempting, The Definitive History of Widescreen. And to my knowledge, he never finished it. And it's sort of been stranded at a length where it's too long for an article and too short for a book and not really in a state where it could be published. Well, I'm very happy to announce that the Academy's Margaret Herrick Library is prepared to add Rick's manuscript and possibly some of his other writings too to the library's special collections. So what that means is that when students and scholars come to research widescreen, which is a pretty popular topic to research, they'll be directed to Rick's authoritative, if unfinished, work. And so his expertise will continue to benefit the community and enrich the scholarship that he cared so much about. So I thought that would be a nice thing to announce now. So here's to Rick. That's it for me. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to turn it over to our Master of Ceremonies, Mr. John Muto. Thank you.
Even though Eric said it, I'll say it again. Welcome. Tonight we're getting together to share some stories about our mutual friend Rick Mitchell. Everyone should feel welcome to speak. Whether or not you saw the sign-up sheet or signed the sign-up sheet, there's time for everyone to say something if you'd like. My name's John Muto. I'm a motion picture production designer. I'm here as a facilitator, a host, if you please. I adored Rick like everyone else here, but I only knew him for a decade or two, so I got the job because I may not wilt under the pressure of the occasion. We shall see. I don't want to use up too many adjectives that you'll need to use to describe Rick tonight. I'll just say that I knew him on sight long before I met him at screenings. Because speaking as an art director, it was always obvious that he was a unique and intriguing guy. Once I got to know him, I really began to admire him because he seemed to live his life exactly as he pleased. He didn't appear to make any compromises. He figured out a way to do it his way, and he stuck with it. And yet, he was warm and thoughtful, friendly and accessible in a way that most of the people we call obsessives or loners or monomaniacs are not. Rick never seemed afraid or self-pitying, even in relation to his frightening health problems. I turned out to be the guy who drove him home after his 2 most recent hospitalizations. After his heart surgery, he seemed fine, maybe a little subdued is all. He insisted we stop at a supermarket on the way home. He didn't want to give me a list, he wanted to shop for himself. The last time I picked him up, he thought ahead and was already provisioned, because he knew he wouldn't be walking for a while. He was quiet in the car, but he seemed fine. Rick inspired you to want to help him, but mostly he didn't need it. So, we'll all be telling anecdotes. I have one to start us off. A story that kind of says it for me about Rick and his film obsession, and I know no one else will have this one. Rick helped me start a film society for the Art Directors Guild. It's been a great success for over 10 years. He's always been there with ideas and advice, never got mad when we didn't follow them, always showed up to the shows, always corrected my factual errors from the audience. And I could never get him on stage. Anyway, it all began, this film society, when I convinced the union to spend the money for me to show the films I wanted to see with the film's designers, who were old-timers that I couldn't think of any other way to meet. So it was all out of enlightened self-interest, of course. I wanted the first show to be something really wonderful, so I went to Rick and asked him if there was some old-time, amazing art director still around that everyone else had forgotten about. I knew if such a guy existed, Rick would know him. He suggested Nathan Duran. Now, I'm a big film expert myself, so I was shocked at this suggestion because I knew Rick had to be confused. Duran's a director, not an art director. As you all know, he directed Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, First Men in the Moon, all that kind of stuff. But, as Rick pointed out, he was an art director before becoming a director. Well, I thought, this is interesting. Maybe we can make something out of this. Had this guy ever designed anything of any importance whatsoever? Rick pointed out to me that Nathan had picked up the 1941 Oscar for the art direction of How Green Was My Valley, beating Citizen Kane. But that's actually not the story. Here's the story. So my plan was working to get to have fun, show my movies, and meet these old guys. I got to hang out now with Nathan Duran, a great guy, a cool Hollywood old-timer. I told him all about Rick, this amazing guy who knew everything about Hollywood. Rick knew the artistic stuff and the practical stuff and even the business stuff. Nathan was interested. He was kind of a know-it-all himself. He'd been an architect and an engineer, and he was like a clockman. He wanted to know about everything. I could tell he was curious about this genius, Rick Mitchell. So we finally had the screening. At the reception afterwards, I finally had my chance to introduce Rick to Nathan. So I pulled them together. I said, Nathan, here's that guy who knows everything. Really, says Nathan. So he paused, and in a very nice way, he asked Rick if it was true that he was such a all-around major league, big-time expert. And Rick agreed that he was fairly knowledgeable. So Nathan said in a nice way, if you're so, and I leave out the adjective, if you're so smart, you tell me where I can find a copy of my film, Flight of the Lost Balloon. I wrote and directed the goddamn thing, and I can't find a copy anywhere. And believe me, I've looked. And there was a beat, and Rick says, well, there's a 16 mil print on my coffee table. And there was. I mean, we made a video copy. In retrospect, I'm sure Rick had pulled the film out of his collection in anticipation of meeting the guy, so it does make sense. It's not bullshit. But it shocked the hell out of Duran at the time. And Rick now had another huge fan. And Rick, too, wound up spending a lot of quality time with an amazingly interesting old guy who you saw in the PowerPoint. And that was Rick's introduction to Ray Harryhausen, because Duran had done 3 pictures with Ray. And it was great for everybody. So that's my great moment with Rick. Now, before we go on to you, I've been asked to read a statement from a person that probably you guys know. I don't know him. Rex McGee? Okay. This is Rex McGee's Memories of Rick Mitchell. As Rex writes, I was only 18 and a USC freshman when I met Rick in 1970. He had been there for a couple of years at that point, I believe. He always seemed to be darting around the old cinema department Stables on terribly serious business. Staples, is that true, Staples?
Yeah.
I'd heard that, yeah. For all I know, he might have slept in the old DKA corner office. I figured out DKA is a Delta Kappa Alpha fraternity, right?
Right.
He had keys to every door with a lock on it, so it was obvious that the cinema powers in those days, Bernie Cantor, whom Rick called the fearless leader, and Herb Farmer, trusted him. It looked to me that R. Mitchell was clearly the man to know. He and I connected early because I was already a union projectionist from Texas, and I knew how to throw a dowser on a 35mm simplex if a nitrate studio print ignited. Rick loved the fact that I had spent most of my teenage years in Fort Worth drive-ins, where my dad was also a projectionist. He thought I had the common man's pro-Corman taste in movies and not that of the elite film buffs whom he mocked. Rick eventually trusted me to run even the Bovard projectors for the early film conference, still a point of pride for me. R. Mitchell didn't trust anybody. Rick hailed from Lexington, Kentucky, and grew up in poverty, I think, but he never spoke about his family. He was proud to tell me, though, that he had been an extra in 20th Century Fox's The Flim Flam Man, which had been shot near Lexington in 1967. Just don't blink, he said. I always believed that his love of old films and his insistence on old ways harkened back to a deep emotional need to reconnect with the times he spent in Kentucky with his family. But who really knows? We both loved film music, Steiner and Korngold and Raxon and Rosa, and we shared our always growing reel-to-reel tape collections. Only 2 years ago, at considerable effort on his ancient Mac, he made and mailed me CD copies of all the soundtracks I somehow missed or didn't bother to buy. Rick kept lists, lots of lists of his credits and his reel tapes and his beloved 8mm and 16mm prints, all typed on what appeared to be a manual typewriter whose letters didn't quite line up. His handwriting, primitive and childlike, was unmistakable. I have many samples of it in my personal belongings, and just looking at that odd scrawl instantly brings back happy memories of him. If only I could find my copies of his meeting minutes of the Delta Kappa Alpha, the honorary cinema fraternity, which he cranked out with that same faulty typewriter. I loved reading his funny, biting commentary about the current events in the department. Rick adamantly refused to recognize the existence of television. He disdained any form of video reproduction of celluloid and refused to expose himself to such heresy. That, of course, made everyone crazy, but he persisted to his final purest days. I always wondered if he had been living in the silent film era, whether he would have lobbied against the advent of sound. It was a question I never got to ask him. I wonder if there is a rosebud in Rick's life that would explain it all. If there is, I'm certain it's buried somewhere in Lexington, Kentucky. He was my very first friend and supporter at USA Cinema. I'll never forget him.
Rick Mitchell was a pretty large part of my life, considering the fact that I was such a small part of his. But I have to tell you how it was that I met him. I was a new entertainment lawyer with my recently minted UCLA law degree, and in 1991 I had a client introduced to me who had made a martial arts movie, and could I please get a distribution deal for his martial arts movie. So I went to see the martial arts movie, and it was titled Breathing Fire, and it was in some level of draft. Some post had been done, and the Chinese client, pretty much fresh off the boat, day glow, short sleeve shirts, Rolex watches, making the movie with money out of his back pocket and cash and keeping very few records, was sitting next to me at this screening, and he kept saying, "Can I get a studio release? Can I get a studio release?" And this movie was in a position of being really dreadful. And someone pointed out to me that that fellow over there was the editor. And it was this fellow who was an African-American fellow. I didn't know him. He had a very serious face. I was a little afraid of him. But I had to do something about this very bad movie that my client wanted to get a studio release for. So I went over and introduced myself, and I told him that I was the attorney going to try and get distribution for this. He rolled his eyes around a little bit. And I wanted to let him know that I wasn't coming completely from left base, so I told him about my doctoral work in film at UCLA, and that I had been to Italy to talk to Sergio Leone because I was writing a dissertation. I wanted to talk about his use of widescreen, spaghetti westerns, and so forth. We connected over that. So I felt I was able to talk to him then, not just as a pushy lawyer. So I looked at the then blank screen and I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Lady, I promise you, I used everything they shot. I mean, everything." And I said, "I see." I said, "Is there anything you think you could do to turn that into something that could get any kind of release at all?" And he said, "If you put me in charge and tell the guy to let me run the show and give me some money, I will go back out and shoot the movie." And I said, "This is a good idea." So I said to the Chinese gentleman, "You must give this man everything he asks of you, or you will get no release at all, because this is America and we don't release anything that looked like that." So it was a very intense conversation, because my client's English was extremely thin, and my horror at what I had seen on the screen was extremely large. But Rick Mitchell shook my hand and he said, "I will fix this for you." And I said, "You do that, dude." And he did. And we got a domestic release for theatrical, and we got a release for foreign theatrical, and we got eventually, it showed up on Blockbuster shelves and so forth. And Breathing Fire was a real movie because Rick Mitchell stepped in and turned what was just nothing into something that actually was a movie that people could watch and go, "Oh, look, a plot." It was great. And so I knew for sure that Rick Mitchell was absolutely the very greatest editor, and that's what made him a really excellent director. So on the way over here tonight, I was thinking about how the time that Rick has left us, and I thought I wanted to say this. I wanted to say, Rick Mitchell occupied and will.
In all the years that I knew Rick, I never heard him try to get any applause or kudos for Breathing Fire. He never even mentioned it to me. I knew Rick for 41 years, and I can't say I knew him well. As many of you are aware, Rick wasn't the most forthcoming person about his past. A short time after I met him, I realized there were many subjects he would not address. If he didn't want to answer a question, he would just give you that toothy smirk. That meant you could wait until hell freezes over to get an answer. The subject of family was off limits. On a couple of occasions, he referred to the segregated theaters in Lexington, Kentucky that ran movies on specific days for black audiences only. He was also a projectionist. I was never clear how Rick ended up at USC Cinema. He was on a projection scholarship, and after my first year there, I was too. Along with Doug Knapp, we spent time working out schedules for class screenings, department events, and the Cinema Fraternity weekly programs. There were also weekend marathons with 4 films on Saturday and 4 more on Sunday, for which Rick was in charge of booking the studio prints, and he did a pretty good job of it. When it came to running nitrate prints, though, Rick would not really inspect the pictures, and when I got to USC as a projectionist, I was told that Rick had been the projectionist of record when reel 4A of Warner's print of Rope went up in flames while being run. At the cinema department, Rick's unique brand of social skills was fully on display. He would walk in and around the department without any effort to acknowledge others and was rarely willing to introduce himself. I was often asked, "Who is that guy?" Rick affectionately, as we know, referred to Dr. Bernie Cantor, chairman of the department, as fearless leader, and Herb Farmer, who ran all the technical aspects, also affectionately as herbicide. Rick and I both loved the films of the 50s, especially those in CinemaScope. That was our point of reference, and with Rick, you really needed a point of reference. CinemaScope was such an obsession with him, he insisted on making student films in the widescreen format. This was unheard of and frowned upon by the instructors, especially the late Dave Johnson, who had a sign on his office wall reading, "What does CinemaScope add to a film? About 2 feet on each side." He was referring to the screen in room 108 where we used to screen student films. Rick continued making 16mm short films after SC under the banner of his Cinemaphile Amalgamated Pictures. He spent whatever money he had left over from either his scholarship or editing work on these epics. They were primitive, but Rick figured that Sam Fuller was a primitive, and look where it got him. Rick definitely championed underdog filmmakers, especially those who made action-packed B-movies. In the 70s, he even avoided going to mainstream theaters, preferring to see movies with real audiences in grindhouses. In fact, even at the Academy screenings, you'd always see Rick right in the first row. He wanted to see everything. One way you could get into a heated discussion with Rick was to suggest a drama with lots of talking was a great movie. Rick firmly believed that movies were made to move, an expression he often repeated. After USC, I kept in touch with Rick when he was an assistant editor at Universal. He periodically wrote scripts typical of the kinds of movies he loved, action and sci-fi genre pieces. I remember reading a couple of them. They had potential, but Rick would stubbornly insist that he would never sell them unless he could direct them himself. For Rick, there was little else in his life besides film and film music. He collected 16mm and 8mm prints of anything he could get his hands on. With meager resources, he would buy what he could, gladly accept hand-me-downs, and treasure it all like it had just been found in a pyramid. Well, there was another page somewhere. Here it is. Rick didn't have many of the advantages most students at USC Cinema had either before or after film school. But in his later years, when work dried up, he had more time to spend on research and was able to unearth many forgotten details of film technology. This became his trademark, and that's how we remember him. The internet was a boon to Rick. He would constantly be sending out blasts of his film reviews and informative tidbits he'd discovered. I received more emails from Rick in a month than from anyone else in a decade. So now, all our mailboxes are emptier without Rick. And hopefully someone younger who received those many emails will be inspired to carry on his passion for research in areas that most film historians don't bother to explore.
I work in the SciTech Council here at the Academy, and Rick was my typical guest for a lot of the SciTech shows, and we would often come and see shows at in this theater. And Although Rick sort of liked the front of the theater, he finally sort of settled on the third row, which was my favorite row. And occasionally I'd come in early for one of the screenings and the theater would be mostly empty and Rick had already settled down in the third row center. And I'd walk up to him and say, "You're in my seat." And occasionally he'd come to me and says, "You're in my seat." So, I would introduce him as an expert, and they'd say, "Well, in what?" And he'd say, "Well, mostly widescreen." And they'd look like, "Oh, that's kind of like being an expert on steam irons, But I'd say, "No, pretty much everything." And like, "Well, how so?" And I say, "Okay, Rick, do you mind?" And like, "Yeah." Like, "Okay." And I talked to the person that just met him and said, "Name an obscure film like between 1950 and 1980. Kind of obscure." And they'd come up with some film that I hadn't even heard of and said, "Okay, Rick, what studio?" He named the studio. "What producer?" He named the producer. Director, cinematographer, format, whether it was stereo, what film stock it was shot on. And they're like, all off the top of his head. And like, okay. But mainly, I have two odd thank yous that I wanted to do tonight. The first one, for those of you that know me, and my expertise is sort of technical and mainly widescreen stuff, is I'd like to thank R. Michael Hayes, who was the co-author of the book Widescreen Movies. I first met Rick in 1994 because I was sitting outside the Gene Autry Museum waiting for a SMPTE meeting to start, and I was talking with someone about the book Widescreen Movies and how it had quite a few errors in it. And Rick says, "Yep." I go turn around like, "What?" He says, "I just wrote a review of that for The Perfect Vision." I said, "Yeah, I saw that." And it wasn't particularly complimentary either. And we struck a bond as our mutual dislike for this book and the author, R. Michael Hayes, as far as the sheer number of errors in this book. Just to put in perspective for those of you that don't know, it's out there on the internet if you want to see Widescreen Movies corrections. It goes 60 pages long. But anyway, if you've ever visited widescreenmuseum.com that Marty Hart does from Texas, he was inspired to put that amazing website together because of his dislike for that book and R. Michael Hayes. But anyway, if it wasn't for that book, I would never have been speaking and met Rick and hitting it off, and we traded back and forth research and information and all sorts of the love of widescreen as opposed to steam irons. The second thank you I wanted to give is for everyone here. Rick is only here in spirit, but this is exactly the sort of get-together that he would love and would go out after the show and to the back lot or to the parking lot of some other theater and talk for 2, 3, 4 hours. And he often did. And I had to explain to my wife occasionally, why was I talking till 1 a.m? It happens. So anyway, this is precisely the sort of get-together Rick would love. And again, thank you all for coming.
Dan is our last scheduled guest. So you'll have a couple minutes to get your courage together if you want to come up while I do a few thank yous. To explain to you how this happened, who put this together, which is Rich Anderson, who you saw at the beginning. Gary Prabula, who is Dan Sherlock, of course. Eric Lichtenfeld from the Academy. Fritz Herzog, the Academy guy as well. Mark Bovey was responsible for the music was put together. Tom March had a lot to do with the photography that was shown earlier. And of course, Ben Burt. Would anyone like to speak?
I'm Edward Nassour. And I first met Rick in 1973. I had just started to work at Universal in the editorial department, and they had assigned me to splice loops. And they still had a looping department at Universal, even though ADR was becoming prevalent at most of the studios. So I went into this little looping room, which was off the corridor of the sound editorial. And seated there at a splicer was this little diminutive black guy. So I sat down and said hello, and he said hello. And we sort of were doing our job. And then it started to dawn on me as he was talking, this guy was an encyclopedia of motion picture information. And I thought I knew a lot myself, but he put me to shame. So we started challenging each other and doing things, asking questions, and it got to be sort of an interesting situation. We worked in that job for about a week. So after a while, I sort of became friends with Rick. We went to a couple of movies. The first movie I went to, I'll never forget. I think it was at the Cinerama Dome or the old Cinerama Theater on Hollywood Boulevard. And I didn't know this. We walked in, the theater was empty. And I always like to sit, as my wife can tell you, towards the back of the theater because it's comfortable for me. I don't like to be up close. Rick starts to move all the way down to the front. I said, "Where are you going?" He says, "Well, I'm going to where I sit," which is dead center in the front. I said, "Well, I've never done that." He says, "Well, try it. You'll like it." So we went down to the front of the theater and sat down, and pretty soon the whole theater started to fill up with people, and they started this movie, and all I can remember, it was like this. Well, after about 5 minutes, I said, "Rick, I'm getting nauseous, and I'm getting a headache. All I see is grain." So I excused myself and tried to find a seat in the back of the theater. And it's interesting to hear that he moved to the third row, because the last time I saw Rick, he was still sitting in the front row. I remember one time Rick invited me and my wife to come up to his house. He would have screenings at his house. And I think he was going to run the Kremlin Letter in CinemaScope or Panavision, whatever. And we got up to his house. He lived on Lookout Mountain. This was up in the Hollywood Hills. And my wife and I got up there, and we were supposed to get up there, let's say 7 o'clock. We rang the doorbell. First of all, we noticed nobody was there except Rick. He opened the door, and he was sitting there eating his TV dinner. So I felt, well, maybe we're not here. Maybe I got the night wrong or something. No, it was right. Pretty soon people started to file in. And we sat in front of this, it looked like 16 feet wide screen, and he ran this film, The Kremlin Letter. And he had an incredible, as everyone knows, he had an incredible collection of 16 millimeter films, and I'm glad to see that those films are going to be taken care of, and shared with people at the Academy here. But in closing, I'd just like to say, I'm as shocked as the first speaker was. I'd known Rick, a long time, 37 years. And although we hadn't seen each other probably in about 3 or 4 years, we still kept in touch via emails, and occasionally we talk. And as anyone knows, when you talk to Rick on the phone, it was 3-hour, 4-hour telephone call. So I was really shocked when I found out, and I found out by reading Marty Hart's website, the Widescreen Museum. And it was a big blow to me. I knew he had been ill. He had emailed me and telling me some of it. He didn't like to talk about his health. I mean, he kept most of it quiet, but he would joke about it. He would say, they're testing this, and I'm off to the hospital again, but I didn't know quite how ill he was. So I just kind of like to think that somewhere up there, wherever he is, he's sitting in the front row in a big super theater watching all his favorite movies. And that's all. Thank you.
Hi, my name is David Furtick, and I've known Rick for about 43 years. I hadn't planned to come up here. Although I'd like to brag, I made Christmas dinner for him for at least the last 30 years. And this is because Gary and Dawn Perbola, who were really good friends of Rick's, always invited strays for their Christmas and Thanksgiving dinners. And I just happened to make Christmas dinner because I was the Christmas Jew. Like, Jews used to have something called the Sabbath Goys. So I made Christmas dinner for Rick for many, many years. Anyway, I hadn't planned to come up here and speak, but as I was listening to all these stories, a thought came back that I probably haven't accessed in over 40 years. So if I'm wrong about the details, please forgive me. I certainly did not have Rick's encyclopedic knowledge, and I'm afraid I was one of those people who came to U.S. cinema because I was enthralled by French New Wave films. And anyway, Rick and I were both in DKA, Delta Kappa Alpha, the film fraternity, and I'm pretty sure that Rick had recommended we see a airplane disaster series one weekend. This is way before Airport. This is probably 68 or 69, I don't remember. I was new there. As a matter of fact, my work with DKA, I filled the Coca-Cola machine. And from that money, we would buy equipment for the department. Anyway, Rick wanted to see one of those airplane disaster series, and so for the whole weekend, we watched films like The High and the Mighty, which I think is about 1954-55. Anyway, a few weeks later, we had a series on detective films, and we're watching Bullet. And Bullet ends in an airport in San Francisco, and of course, High and the Mighty begins with an airport in Honolulu. Anyway, after Bullet was over, and of course it was a very exciting chase film, but early on when we're in the airport, Rick said, "Did you notice that Paramount loop of Helen Bell, come to the office please, Helen Bell?" He says, "That's the same damn loop that they used back in The High and the Mighty." And he says, "They're still looking for her 12 years later." Well, I was totally intimidated because I had no idea people had that sense of, observation. In any case, it just came to me as I was sitting listening to all these other wonderful stories. Thank you.
So who wants to follow that? Oh, good.
Hi, I'm Joanne D'Antonio. I'll never be as funny as David, but I was at all those Christmas dinners and then some, I think. Rick, when he started coming to the dinners, was pretty quiet, and I had known him from Weddington because Rick was a Foley editor at Weddington, and I was cutting, I don't know, sometimes it was sound effects and sometimes it was ADR, but I think that Rick was feeling like he was not getting more work because Foley editors were kind of going out of need at that time. And I said, why don't you expand into something else? And he said, well, really, I'm a picture editor and I don't really want to do anything besides Foley. And I thought, well, gee, that's pretty, limited. But I didn't really have much of a conversation beyond that with Rick. And but we saw each other at this Christmas gathering, and I had written a book about Andrew Marton, and I guess the diehard film buffs will know that he actually was the one who directed The Chariot Race and Ben-Hur. And the book was actually an oral history, and I had known his daughter and his stepdaughter, and that's how I'd come to write the book. And it was a very long book, and I was asked by the DGA who sponsored the book to make it ready for publishing, and I took it upon myself to correct all the technical errors that I knew Martin would have wanted corrected in the book, because he was very technically oriented, and I just couldn't put a book out there with errors in it. So I looked up things. This was before the internet, and it was a really big job. And when the book came out, I was really worried, because I'd heard of Rick's encyclopedic knowledge, and I thought, oh my God, I have to spend Christmas with Rick, and how's that going to work? And sure enough, he was friendlier all of a sudden, and it turned out that not only had he bought the book, which was a very expensive book. It's like, at that time it was $65, and now I think it's $85. So it's sort of my own fault, because I wanted photographs in it, and that they told me that would up the price. So Rick had read the book and had found very little to criticize in the book. And I mean, it's just so unbelievably minor that, and I said, well, I know he's very pedantic, so I took that as a huge compliment, that there was really, really tiny, almost no errors. So and then I was very grateful to him, because there was a screening of Ben-Hur at this revival theater in Glendale, and I can't even remember the name right now. Someone will have to help me. Alex, yes, at the Alex Theater, and they asked me if they could put my book on display, and would I provide a copy of it. And I only had one that was signed by Martin, and I didn't want to part with that, and I had very short notice, and couldn't get my hands on a copy. And of course Rick had one, and he actually stood on the corner in the cold to give me his copy of the book so that they could put on display. And he came to the screening and was very supportive. So ever since, every Christmas and Thanksgiving that I would see him, he was extremely friendly, and I think my stock in his mind went up, because the book passed muster with Rick Mitchell.
I met Rick about 10 years ago. I was doing a little documentary on Cinerama, and I'd consult with him periodically with emails and stuff. Oh, what do you think about this? And what if I take this approach? What do you think about that? And he would usually generally agree with me, so we were pretty much in sync with each other. And then when Warner Brothers decided to buy the documentary, I decided to get a lawyer. I said, about time, I guess I should get a lawyer halfway through this process. And so I contacted somebody through the IDA, and I got a lawyer who I found out later was best friends with the head of Warner Home Video. And my wife said, I don't think that's a good idea. So eventually, and of course I never wanted to fire anybody. That's, I'm not good at that kind of thing, And so eventually I mentioned it to Rick, and he said, well, I've got someone you should use as a lawyer. And I said, well, who? And he said, Aline McGarity, which I'm sorry she left, because I haven't seen her for about 2 years. And I wasn't sure, how much does Rick know about lawyers and contracts and stuff? Should I be going with her or try to find somebody on my own? And then I figured he had such a detailed mind about everything else, why not throw the legal profession in there too? And so I contacted Eileen, and she literally took over, ran rings around all the Warner Brothers lawyers. I didn't even have to fire the other guy. He just backed off when he heard her name. And she came in there, and she would be telling me some of these stories about talking to the lawyer today, and she ended up being like a mother hen to the Warner Brothers lawyers who were making the deal with me through her. Well, that was all because of Rick, And so we'd always invite him over to the house whenever we'd have these backyard barbecues and stuff. And we had one this year, and we told him that we were
dug up the old Cinerama camera, and we're actually going to shoot something, which we were late to the meeting tonight because we were shooting tests in my driveway for focus. And Doug Knapp is here somewhere too, who worked with Rick for years, and we sat over dinner tonight as we were, rolling the magazines. We're actually shooting film, by the way. It's Cinerama. It has sprocket holes and stuff, and we kept thinking, and when we mentioned this to Rick, he was so excited. He wanted to be a part of it. And we said, well, absolutely, sure. You just come on. Whenever we do something, we'll let you know. And, of course, we sort of felt his presence in shooting these tests in the last couple of days. But anyway, that's our story of Rick, that he knew enough about the legal profession to turn me on to the right people to run rings around the Warner Brothers lawyers.
Hi. Yeah, I first met him in the spring of I'm guessing about 1973 when I was at USC. And Rick was one of the big kids. If you remember when you're younger, the big kids were always kind of intimidating. Especially because he was one of the guys who, as mentioned earlier, really ran the cinema department in USC. Rick was the kind of guy who didn't suffer fools and could be quite off-putting when you dealt with him. But amazingly, instead of hating him, it somehow made you try harder to get on his good graces. And once you got to meet him, you found that he wasn't such a tough nut, that he really had a great heart, and he would go out of the way to help you. And I have to thank him. He taught me how to be a projectionist, which maybe today doesn't mean anything in the digital era. But at that time, he inducted me into the secret world of 35 millimeter nitrate prints and changeovers and the mysterious arc lamps, which have gone the way of many other things, but were quite intimidating. Over the years, I got quite close to Rick, and he did open up to me a little bit about his background. He was born near Lexington in September of 1946, though I never found this out until after he died. Apparently we got this from the Union. But he grew up in Lexington, in the Lexington area, and he told me he intended sort of a low middle. His family was sort of, I guess you'd call it, lower middle class, and he attended integrated schools, and then somehow, this I never heard, he got into being a projectionist, and but the theaters in Lexington only just ran 35 millimeter, so. Apparently, he used to, on weekends or when he could get away, he would go to the big city of Cincinnati, which is where he could see 70 millimeter and Cinerama and all these widescreen specialty formats that he had heard about. Now, you kind of well wonder how, oh, I should mention too, he went to Transylvania College. There's actually a college near Lexington. I saw the sign once while driving to Washington, D.C. off the highway. It's actually called Transylvania College. It sounds like a joke for a vampire film, but apparently he did some undergraduate work there, though he actually got a BA in cinema from USC. How did he get here? Somebody, I forget, mentioned earlier about the Flim Flam Man. This film was shot in and around the Lexington area in 1967. And I guess Rick heard about it and being a film nut went over there. And as somebody said, he is in one scene. It's, I think years ago he showed me the scene. I wish I had gotten a frame enlargement or something. But anyway, it's on a scene of a small country store or something like that. And it's one of those things where he's there and then the camera pans. So it's like if you blink, you miss him. But amazingly, for an extra, right, he got talking to the director, Irving Kershner. Now, how that happened, I don't know, but Rick had his ways. And Irving Kershner must have seen behind the young man from a smaller eastern town, that Rick had a special something about film. So basically, he gave him the "Go West, young man" speech, and apparently wrote some sort of letters or something recommending him. So Rick came out to Hollywood and got a job in the mailroom at Universal. from there, somehow he got into editorial, and I think one of his first jobs was he was in the stock film library, which, for those of you who don't know, this is where, like, if you're doing a movie about New York and you need a shot of an ocean liner in front of the city or something like that, you'd go, and instead of spending the money to shoot it, you'd just go to this library of footage and you'd see if they had something. So Rick was very clever, though, because a lot of people would have just said, oh, we don't have one of those. But a lot of times Rick would say, oh, no, we don't have it in the Universal Library, but I have a shot like that in my library. So if for some reason, say, I'm just making something up, if they needed a shot of Hollywood Boulevard with, say, Larry Edmunds' shop in it or something like that, Rick had a 35 millimeter camera, an old Eclair Camoflex or whatever, one of those that could shoot both 16 and 35. So if he heard they needed it, he would then run out, get a short end of film, and go to Hollywood Boulevard and shoot that shot of Larry Edmunds on Hollywood Boulevard, and then come back. And because he wasn't in the camera local, of course, because, you know, it was a union shop over there, but he could supply it to them as a library. So he would make extra money, essentially shooting stock footage for Universal TV shows and movies. So as somebody said, he was a committed film guy. To his dying day, he never owned a television or VCR or a DVD player or anything. In fact, if you were going to say, oh, I have a DVD of that, it's almost like saying, you know, handing a, you know, some high-tech thing to a caveman or something. It's almost like he wouldn't have known what to do with it. So, but it wasn't that he couldn't figure it out, because he was actually very smart with technical things. It's just to him, entertainment was on film, and that was it. As everybody said, his passion in his life was widescreen films, and he worked for me and other people at Weddington Productions for many years as a Foley editor. But Rick would only take screen credit on films that were in widescreen format. If it was shot with spherical lenses, forget it. He didn't want screen credit on it. He just didn't care. So and Rick was even suspect with Super 35. That was sort of like a wannabe, you know, but it wasn't true widescreen. I have to thank Rick, because Rick was an assistant editor handling the opticals, the visual effects on Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and which, for those of you who know, was like way behind on all the visual effects, because it was just, they changed visual effects people and it was just screwed up. So they shot in so many formats. I think one of Rick's main jobs was just to try and coordinate all the different people, different effects houses around town shooting in every format known to man. You know, it's like, it looked like the chart in Dan Sherlock's office. But somehow, when they were looking for a sound editor, Rick said, oh, I got a friend who's good at that. And at that time, I had really only worked on low-budget stuff, Roger Corman movies and TV movies, and I really didn't have any sort of credibility in that big world. And somehow, Rick got me an appointment with the editor on the film, Todd Ramsey, and I got the job. It was amazing, you know, because that was like a $50 million movie, which for 1979 was, you know, like the national debt or something. So I really want to thank Rick because I don't know what my career would have been without that. You know, I might have spent the rest of my career doing Roger Corman movies and TV movies. So I'm really indebted to Rick for that, and I could never repay him for that. I also want to say that on the stuff that I've directed, Rick was always the editor, and he always did a wonderful job. And I always, as working with him, even though I could edit film, I always felt it was really important to have a separate editor, because Rick would look at footage and see something that I never would have seen in it, and put the film together differently than maybe I'd imagined, and it was always better. Rick could see that something in the film. And so I would say to any filmmakers here, you know, even if you can edit your film, if possible, have a separate editor, because they bring a new viewpoint to you. In fact, I missed him earlier this year. I directed a film in China last year, and we were editing this year, and I really missed him because I felt that he was a much better editor than the one I got. But unfortunately, due to the international, it wouldn't work out. I have another story about when he was a Foley editor. For those of you who cut Foley, cutting the footsteps is a bit of a thankless job. It all has to be done to synchronize the walker's walk against the picture, but it's never quite perfect. But it's a bit of a thankless job, syncing, you know, on a feature film, syncing track after track of people walking around. So Rick's mind was always working. And so instead of just saying, say the main character was called Bob, instead of saying Bob Footsteps, he started labeling the things, and unfortunately I can't think of good examples now, I'll say, but he would label the tracks with all these obscure references to other movies. And it's one thing, because I used to see him, but a lot of times later on I would say, you know, the only people seeing it is the Foley editor. I mean, the mixer. I'm not even seeing the cue sheets. They're in front of him, and you know, those guys are like, because they'd say to me, what is this track? What does this mean? I don't get it. And so I'd say, oh well, that's Rick. So, but I could never get him not to do that. I do have one example. In the movie Daylight, there's a scene where, as the water's rising in this tunnel, all these sewer rats come in and kind of run through the scene. And Rick always had a dim view of producers. He always felt that producers were the people kind of like that got in the way of the directors. So Rick, we had done little scurrying sounds for this. So Rick had labeled them producers left, producers center, and producers right. So that was the kind of guy he was. As someone said, Rick had his own way of doing things, and no matter how much I tried to explain to him that I wasn't going to see all the cue sheets, and a lot of his references were so obscure I didn't get them either. Yeah. But nevertheless, that's what he did it. Anyway, I also find it hard to believe that Rick is gone. I know he had been in deteriorating health, but after he had his toe removed, about a month or so before he died, he called it zha-zhaing. He seemed to be okay. I hadn't seen him. I had to go back to China, and so I didn't see him at the time he had it done. He seemed to be better. And then one day I noticed that his emails, which, as Aubrey said, were constant, had stopped. And I had tried to call him, ask him a question about a film, old film, you know, the kind of thing that only Rick would know. And he didn't return my phone calls. So I mentioned it to Gary Pibula, and somehow he got a hold of Rick's landlord, and that's how they found him. That he had died, they say, of natural causes, though more specifically, who knows. But perhaps it's fittingly, they found his body underneath the screen in his apartment. So, not that anybody would want to go, but maybe for Rick, that's the place he would have liked to have been found the best. And I just like to say that if there is an afterlife now, I like to imagine that Rick is up there with all the filmmakers that he loved, like Alfred Hitchcock and Michael Curtiz, and his special favorite, Raoul Walsh, and they're sitting up there and discussing how, you know, the best way to make films. Because in heaven, everything's shot in 70 millimeter.